The idea that everything is connected by some kind of energy, by a field of energy, it was actually a very popular idea in the late 1800s. In the late 1800s, there was this tremendous spiritual revolution that was sweeping the scientific world. And the scientists were forcing themselves to come to terms. They had to know, is there a field that connects all things and makes these connections meaningful in our lives, or are we in fact separate from everything else? They said we need to know once and for all. Let's go back to 1887. In 1887, two very famous scientists, Michelson and Morley, designed an experiment to finally settle the argument, to tell us once and for all, is there a field that connects all things, or is everything really separate? Michelson and Morley, and other scientists as well, they believed that this field that connects all things, that this ether field, was a living, vibrating, pulsating field of energy, and that it should be in motion, and if they could detect that motion, that it would determine and answer the question as to whether or not the field exists truly once and for all. So they designed an experiment, and I'm going to call your attention to the image that you're seeing right now. This is a very rare image of the actual device. It was called an interferometer, the Michelson-Morley interferometer. This is what the device looked like, and I'm going to give you a schematic of what it was actually doing. What the experiment was doing was shooting a beam of light against one mirror that would split that beam to two different mirrors in two different places, reflect them back to a collecting mirror, and the idea was this: if the field's in motion, those two beams of light would not come back to the same place at the same time. There would be what is called an interference pattern, and that's what they were looking for, was an interference pattern in the light beams. Well, they conducted this experiment in 1887, 1888, and what they determined from that experiment, in my opinion, I think it was a good experiment, but I think it was poorly interpreted. They had no way of knowing in their time what we now know today, and they didn't have the quality of equipment in their time that we have today. So in my opinion, it was poorly interpreted because they believed that there was no interference pattern that they witnessed, and from that, Michelson and Morley concluded, and they published in scientific journals, peer-reviewed scientific journals in the late 1800s, that there is no field. And you say, okay, I understand the experiment. What does it mean? Why is it important? From 1887 until only recently, this means that all science, the best science of the modern world, as good as it's been, has been based in a false assumption that there is no field, that everything is separate from everything else, that there is no field of energy that connects what's happening in one place to what's happening somewhere else. This is the science. Science, for 300 years, has struggled as to whether or not this field actually exists. 1887, from that point forward, all of our science has been based in a belief of separation, that is, until recently. 100 years later, 1987, there was an experiment that was conducted under the auspices of the United States Air Force. They had better equipment, much better equipment, but they used precisely the same principle that Michelson and Morley had used 100 years earlier, and guess what they found? 100 years later, the Air Force sanctioned experiment found that there is, in fact, a field of energy that connects all things. And not only does the field exist, it exists precisely within the parameters that Michelson and Morley expected it to exist. They just didn't have the equipment to prove it. So we now know that this field actually exists. The results of the Air Force experiment were published in the very prestigious journal Nature in August of 1986, almost 100 years later, and the scientific community discovered that they had been assuming falsely the separation of all things. So now we know there is a field, and it is accurate to talk about the field and the fact that it exists. So there is no longer a question in the scientific community as to whether or not this field exists. The question is, what does it mean in our lives? They've given this field a new name. As I mentioned before, we can no longer call it the ether field. Sometimes it's called the quantum field. Sometimes people like to call this God, or the source, or the matrix, or the divine matrix. All of these terms, maybe you have one of your own, but just because we can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And that what happens in this field that we cannot see actually influences, and in many cases drives, the events that we see in our everyday lives. We now know that this field exists. We now know that we're connected to the field. The question is, what does the field do? I'm going to invite you to think about this field as fulfilling three fundamental capacities. The field is three things. It is the container for all things. It's the bridge between our inner and our outer worlds. And it is the mirror in the world around us for what we believe to be true, consciously and subconsciously, from within.